Me, Jim Jones, myself. Gold records, platinum records, gold albums, platinum albums. No, me, Jim Jones. No diplomats, no nobody else. Me, Jim Jones. Pull up Nas Billboard entries, then pull up my Billboard entries.
So I don't have much to say about it because I don't believe that Jim Jones believes that he's a better rapper than Nas.
There are levels to rap, and sometimes stepping out of your lane puts you in the line of fire.
2025, I'm in the game still rapping at a high capacity. If Nas wants to smoke, come in the booth. I will rap circles around.
So when Jim Jones stood on a mic and said he was better than Nas, it wasn't just confidence. It lit a fuse that exposed years of tension, misunderstanding, and public perception.
Jim Jones was never better than Nas. Jim Jones will never be better than Nas. You smoke, right?
Yeah.
Were you smoking when you said you better than Nas?
I might have been a little bit. Well, as far as, let's get this right. I'm way more influential than Nas, and I don't care what nobody says.
Hip-hop never truly embraced Jim Jones, not like it did his peers, and this is why.
Look, no disrespect to Jim, but Jim's not even close.
It was a regular interview, chill setting. Jim Jones was sitting across from Angie Martinez talking about his journey, his music, his legacy. Then he dropped the line, "I rap better than Nas." No hesitation, no laughing, just straight face. Angie blinked, the room paused, and the minute that clip hit the internet, it exploded. Now here's the thing, Jim's always been confident. That's part of his brand. He talks heavy. But saying you rap better than Nas, that's a different kind of bold. Nas isn't just a rapper, he's Nas, the kid who dropped Illmatic at 19. The guy who's been name-dropped in textbooks and rap battles for decades. People see him as one of the cornerstones of lyrical excellence. So when Jim said what he said, it hit a nerve.
Shit Jim says doesn't even make sense compared to what Nas has done for our culture.
Yeah. Social media lit up, clips flew, memes popped up within minutes. But it wasn't just internet noise. You started hearing reactions from inside the culture, NORE on his podcast, Charlemagne calling it a reach, Fat Joe raising eyebrows, Jadakiss chiming in. Nobody was throwing shade necessarily, but the message was clear. Jim, come on, don't do that.
Jim Jones has 9 entries in the Billboard 200 with 3 top 10 albums and no number ones, while Nas has 27 entries, 16 top 10 albums, and 6 that have reached number 1 on the Billboard.
And it wasn't hate. It was hip-hop doing what it does, protecting the pen. Respect in this game doesn't come just from confidence or attitude. It comes from the work, from timeless bars, classic records, and how deep your impact runs. Jim's catalog has some solid moments. We Fly High, Ballin', early Dipset records, but if we're keeping it real, his lane was more about energy and presence than lyrical depth. That's not slander. That's just how fans and critics have viewed it for years. Now, to be fair to Jim, he did come back around later. Tried to clarify, said he wasn't trying to discredit Nas, just felt like he'd grown into his own sound and had confidence in his skill. But by then, the clip had already taken a life of its own. And here's what made it worse. This wasn't just a wild moment in an interview. For some, it confirmed an old feeling, that Jim had a habit of talking bigger than his body of work. Not everybody saw it that way, but it definitely gave people ammo. In barbershops, in comments, on podcasts, people started pulling out old tapes, revisiting his verses, comparing discographies. The question wasn't whether Jim had hits, it was whether the industry ever really saw him as a rapper's rapper or just Dipset's hype man who held it down on the sidelines.
Playing at a high level,
Hey,
you check my record, you heard?
jumping up and
I'm
down.
still playing at a high level. I'm rapping at a high level. You better check my stats, bro. I will run circles around Nas rap.
Some say the comment was just ego. Others say it was Jim trying to finally get the recognition he felt he never got. Either way, the reaction was heavy, and it wasn't the first time he'd said something that made folks look twice. But this time, the crowd wasn't laughing it off, they were holding receipts. And the part that probably stung the most, it wasn't outsiders dragging him. It was folks inside the circle, industry heads, fellow New Yorkers, even some people he came up with. They didn't dog him, they just didn't co-sign it. And in this culture, sometimes silence hits harder than shade. But as loud as the internet got, the real test wasn't the memes or think pieces. It was what happened next. When folks who knew Jim personally, who were around when Dipset was forming, when Harlem was on fire, they started speaking up. That's where this story turns. Because the real tension around Jim Jones wasn't just about bars, it was about respect. And in Chapter 2, that respect starts cracking from within. If there's one thing hip-hop respects almost as much as talent, it's loyalty, especially when you come from a place like Harlem, where reputations are everything. And Jim Jones. His history with Cameron and Mace was messy.
I never needed nowhere to stay. You act like on your couch. You was a fan. You begged us. You are a fan. A fan. We didn't grow up with you.
Back in the late 90s and early 2000s, Dipset looked unstoppable. Cameron, Jim Jones, and Juelz Santana formed one of the most iconic collectives in hip-hop. Their swag was unmatched, their slang contagious, and their visuals defined an era. But even from the start, Jim was seen as the hype man, not the rapper. In an infamous Hot 97 interview, Jim argued with Mace about Harlem roots, loyalty, and respect. Mace checked him hard, told him he didn't really rep Harlem like that. The tension was raw, and it wasn't just radio drama, it exposed a deeper rift. Cameron, who brought Jim into the rap game, later distanced himself. The two had a public fallout. Cam even joked that Jim had identity issues, that he was trying to rewrite his place in Dipset's legacy. And to some fans, it felt like Jim was constantly playing catch-up, trying to prove he was more than just the third wheel in a flashy duo. Add to that the moment Jadakiss called him out for mentioning Styles P in a song. That wasn't just a diss, it was a check. A reminder that certain names hold weight in New York. And if you're gonna say something slick, you better have the resume to back it up. To this day, Cam and Jim have an on and off relationship. They're cool now, publicly. But there's always been that tension, and when your closest collaborators hesitate to fully vouch for you, the culture notices.
I could have, out of all the crazy stuff he been saying lately, that was definitely right on.
It wasn't just about who rapped the best, it was about who the streets believed. And when Jim started burning bridges with the very people who put him on, the streets started turning their backs too.
I'm all for new and change, but I'm not for riding the coattail of and then getting to a place and trying to stun on the you was riding the whole time. I don't like that.
And it only got worse when he ran into someone who really had nothing to lose.
Smell me?
Jimmy.
Word. And you already know what it is, man.
By the time Jim's issues with Cameron and Mace had gone public, his credibility within the rap world had already taken some serious hits. But things went from bad to worse when the doubt crossed over. From the booth to the block, the Dipset drama had made him look emotionally unstable. But what came next? It made some people question whether Jim Jones was ever really built like that to begin with. This wasn't Cameron airing him out on a podcast. This wasn't Mace clowning him on Hot 97. This was the street speaking. If you were outside during the late 2000s and early 2010s, you probably already know the name. Ronald Raw Diggs Heron wasn't a rapper who turned gangster. He was the real thing. Convicted kingpin, federal informant, and alleged enforcer who once said he'd rather go out like Nino than come home like Sammy. He wasn't chasing clout, he was the clout. And when Jim Jones crossed paths with Raw Diggs, that Dipset swagger didn't count for much. According to multiple street sources and more than one YouTube expose, Jim Jones showed up to a Brooklyn block function, expecting his usual respect, but Raw Diggs wasn't impressed by the chains, the music videos, or the bloodset repping. Word is, Diggs publicly called him out and spared him. Not physically, but socially. Witnesses say Raw stepped to Jim with no hesitation, questioned who he really was, and told him straight up, "You're not that guy out here. No brawl, no shooting, just pure energy." In that silence, it hit harder than a punch. Now here's what made it worse. This wasn't just any street guy calling him out. Raw Diggs had a rep, certified. His words held weight. So when he checked Jim in front of everybody, and Jim didn't push back, it meant something. Not only did Jim fail to stand tall, he reportedly left without saying much at all. For fans online, it was easy to dismiss, just another urban legend. But for those inside the culture, for those who understood street politics, it was a message. You might rap about that life. You might throw up a set on stage. But when the wolves come out, what happens? Suddenly, people weren't just questioning Jim's music or his past. They were questioning his whole identity. This wasn't about lyrics anymore. This was about survival and perception. And let's be clear, this wasn't the first time Jim had claimed connections to serious people. He often name-dropped OGs, flaunted street alliances, and leaned heavy on that Dipset Bloods affiliation. But none of that mattered when the aura faded. Because when you say you're street, but the street doesn't say it back, That's when the respect stops. The raw dig situation didn't make front page news, but it didn't need to. In places where reputation matters more than money, it was a loud moment. And Jim, he never addressed it directly, never denied it, never confronted it. It just hung there, like a stain on his jacket. And from that moment on, people started to look at Jim differently.
Then these little running around, like I wasn't brought up. I was brought up toting slammers. Like, so my belt had to be extra tight.
If Jim Jones had been bruised by the Dipset drama and humbled by raw digs in the streets, what did 50 Cent do next? That was straight up public humiliation. And the worst part, it wasn't even personal for 50. It was just sport. Let's rewind a bit. 50 and Jim weren't always at odds. In fact, at one point, there was mutual respect, at least on the surface. They were both repping street teams, talking big money, and playing the independent hustle game hard.
It sounds like he want to do one with 50 Cent. That's what it sounds like. It sounds like Jim.
Nah, I don't want to do nothing with that sucker.
But that changed the minute Jim started publicly taking shots, first at Mace, then at Cam, and then at actual numbers. Because in 50 Cent's world, once you start talking numbers, you better have receipts. And Jim didn't. When Jim dropped his El Capo album, he expected praise. Instead, he got mocked. 50 took to Instagram like a kid in a candy store, clowning Jim for weak sales numbers. One post showed a screenshot of Jim's sales report, barely cracking 5 figures. The caption, brutal. 50 wasn't done. He brought up Jim's wiretap scandal too. Yeah, that one. When federal documents surfaced tying Jim to a phone conversation with Tekashi 6ix9ine, INE, and Mel Murda, it lit up the internet like wildfire. No indictments, no charges, but the damage already done. Because perception matters more than paperwork, and 50 pounced. He threw shade with surgical precision, implying without saying it outright that Jim was playing both sides. He even went as far as calling Jim a dry snitch in an IG caption, followed by a million laughing emojis. For a guy like 50 Cent, trolling is an art form, but for Jim, it was a PR nightmare.
Jimmy popping all that bullshit. I be seeing you, Jimmy, talking about we Gucci boo boo. He in the Gucci store talking about we Gucci boo boo. Them Black King niggas was going up. Jimmy, they was like, Marita Monero.
Jim tried to hold his ground. He brushed it off, laughed back, called 50 a clown. But the internet doesn't forget. And when someone with 50 Cent's platform aims at you and hits, you're gonna feel it. And the wild thing is, 50 didn't even drop a diss record. He didn't need to. A few memes, some IG captions, and suddenly Jim Jones was trending for all the wrong reasons. People weren't talking about Jim the rapper. They were talking about Jim the punchline. All of this, combined with his past beefs, the credibility issues, the street rumors, painted a picture Jim couldn't shake. The Capo title started to feel ironic, because while Jim was still calling himself a general, a lot of people weren't following his orders anymore. And the worst part, he had no real way to fight back. It wasn't just about beef, it was about respect. And once 50 made Jim look like a clown on a national stage, the whispers turned to laughter. For Jim Jones, that might have been the loudest silence of all.
I definitely believe there's more to this story because Jim Jones is way smarter than that. And
yeah, you know, I don't know what's going on.
I've been in those situations where you in the car with somebody and somebody finds some drugs and nobody wants to claim anything until you get to the police station, and then the person who it was like, it's mine, but then it's too late by then.
By this point, Jim Jones wasn't just fighting for respect, he was chasing it. After years of playing second fiddle in Dipset, taking L's in interviews, and becoming a meme courtesy of 50 Cent, Jim needed a spark. But the move he made next, it wasn't a spark. It was gasoline on an open flame. In a sit-down with Angie Martinez, Jim dropped a line that had the internet spinning. I'm better than Nas, ain't nobody bumping Nas in the streets like that. The internet froze. Twitter exploded, hip-hop heads, confused, offended, laughing, sometimes all three. Because to say you're better than Nas, the man behind Illmatic, It Was Written, Stillmatic, KD 1, 2, 3, and a Grammy win that came nearly 3 decades into his career, Fat Joe, Jadakiss, even NORE, all dudes who came up in the same circles as Jim, had to set the record straight.
I admired Nas, but remember Nas' first record, The Barbecue, came out when I was in 11th grade. So Nas was my idol when I was young. Like you did, came to dressing, the wordplay, the music, everything. I was a superior Nas fan.
Even NORE, one of Jim's closest industry allies, took to his own Drink Champs platform to gently shut it down. We love Jim, but that ain't a conversation, bro. The point wasn't whether Jim Jones had hits. The point was, what are we even talking about here? Nas is a cultural blueprint. Jim as well, Jim. Even diehard Dipset fans had to look away. Because when the people who actually like you start saying, yeah, nah, that's tough. It didn't help that Nas had just come off his King's Disease trilogy, 3 projects praised for lyricism, maturity, and staying power. Meanwhile, Jim was still doing street flex raps with a mixtape rollout strategy from 2007. But here's the kicker. Jim doubled down. When he got the backlash, he didn't clarify, he didn't walk it back. He explained himself. He said it was about relevance, about the streets, about who people were listening to in his world. And that was the issue. Because his world didn't look like the rest of hip-hop's world anymore. The response? A collective eye roll. Because the culture isn't just the corner anymore. It's global. And globally, Nas is a titan. Jim's comments ended up sounding less like a bold claim and more like someone desperate to be heard. And remember, this wasn't just about taste, it was about legacy. Nas had nothing to prove. He was outliving the eras. He was aging gracefully. And Jim? He was still fighting for a seat at the table 20 years in. And for a lot of fans, this was the moment they realized Jim didn't understand the respect he was trying to earn. Because in hip-hop, you don't ask for your flowers. You make music so undeniable that people hand you the bouquet.
They scream it.
Even your own circle starts backing away. The thing about moments like Jim's "I'm better than Nays" claim is, they don't just affect how the public sees you, they shake your inner circle too. Because respect in hip-hop isn't just about how loud you talk. It's about how many people are still standing behind you when you do. And for Jim Jones, that support started getting thin. The shift didn't happen overnight. You could trace the tension back to the early 2000s, but it didn't really start unraveling in full view until Mace re-entered the picture. Now remember, Mace was there before the Dipset era even found its legs. He knew Cameron and Jim from Harlem days when things were still on the corner, not on camera. So when he popped up on platforms making it clear he wasn't feeling the way Jim was speaking on cam, that hits different. Because Mace wasn't trying to play industry politics, he was calling things out from an older, insider perspective. And while Jim tried to push back, the energy was off. It didn't feel like two guys having a difference of opinion. It felt like family drama leaking into the public. Then came the Hot 97 tape. The old one from 2004, resurfacing like a scar that never fully healed. Jim, Mace, Cameron all arguing live on air. No script, no PR filter, just Harlem tension with the microphones hot. And listening to it years later, it became clear. Those relationships had been cracked for a while. Public unity, private mess. As Jim pushed harder into solo visibility, more interviews, more street talk, more trying to explain his version of things, it didn't feel like Cam was matching that energy. Cameron wasn't co-signing, wasn't showing up in the same clips, wasn't standing on the same stage. He was deliberately distant, and the fans saw it. There were moments where Cam would respond, but even then it was usually dry, dismissive, sometimes sarcastic. The message was clear. Whatever Jim's doing right now, that's on him. And it wasn't just Cam. Styles P, another respected name in New York rap, didn't let Jim slide either. When Jim brought his name into one of those online debates, Styles made it clear he didn't appreciate the mention and reminded everyone what the streets really respect. It wasn't loud talk or internet flexing. It was consistency, honor, staying out the mess. The shift in energy was real. Jim Jones wasn't just pushing for respect anymore, he was starting to look isolated. That isolation wasn't only about beef, it was about timing. Cam had reinvented himself. Podcasts, content, smart business plays. Mace had leaned into the preacher-turned-podcaster lane. Even Juelz Santana, quiet as he's been, never jumped into these debates. But Jim? He was still circling the block, still doing interviews trying to explain Dipset dynamics, Harlem history, who did what and when. And the more he talked, the more it seemed like people were turning the volume down. In a culture that thrives on crew love, Wu-Tang, G-Unit, Outkast, Dipset included, it matters when the crew starts to fade out of your frame. Jim had always fought harder than the others for recognition, but somewhere along the line, it stopped feeling like a grind and started feeling like a solo campaign. By the time Jim Jones had pushed through decades of interviews, albums, and viral clips, one thing still hadn't changed: the respect problem. It kept following him. Not because he didn't work hard, Not because he didn't stick around, but because somewhere along the way, the image he built and the reality people saw never truly lined up. And nowhere was that gap more visible than in that quiet moment with Raw Diggs. Now, this wasn't a beef that went trending on Twitter. It didn't get debated on radio shows or chopped up into podcast reactions. But people in the room, people who understood the weight of street presence, they never forgot it. Raw Diggs pulled up on Jim, calmly, directly, and in person. No shouting match, no theatrics. And Jim, who was known for all his tough talk in interviews and diss tracks, didn't push back. He didn't stand on any of that bravado. He folded. And that moment stuck, not because it was violent, not because it was dramatic, but because it was clear. The gap between the energy Jim Jones carried on camera and the one he showed in that room, too wide. It was the kind of moment that doesn't need a press release. Word just travels, quietly, effectively, and that's often more damaging than anything said into a mic. See, the issue with Jim wasn't just one bad headline or one off-key statement, it was a pattern. He'd take bold stances, like saying he was better than Nas, only to get corrected by the culture, the fans, even his own peers. He'd fall out with Mace, Cameron, and others who helped shape his name. And instead of it being handled like a private rift, it spilled into the public like another messy chapter. And then there was that Raw Diggs moment, a reminder that street energy can't be mimicked. It's either real or it isn't. And in that room, Jim didn't look like the guy he'd been portraying. So by the time you add it all up, the interviews, the back and forths, the image versus reality, you start to see why hip-hop never really gave Jim Jones the kind of respect he spent years chasing. And to be fair, it wasn't because he lacked hustle. If anything, Jim hustled more than most. He never stopped showing up, never stopped talking his talk, never stopped trying to control the narrative. But respect doesn't come from volume, it comes from foundation. When people looked closely, they saw a man still trying to convince them he belonged in a conversation that the culture had already moved on from. Whether it was lyrical rankings, street credibility, or industry status, Jim just never quite stuck. The respect was never denied maliciously, it just never felt earned the way it needed to be. And for all the music, all the podcasts, all the headlines, that's the part that really told the story. Because in hip-hop, presence is everything. And when it mattered most, Jim didn't hold the room. That will be all for now. Please like, comment, and share. Goodbye.